the rarest, the shortest lived, JD's handed Letterman with the last of the Steel Warriors, the Mk14 Mod2. So let's talk about it, guys. Since the global war on terror, there has been a dozen different variants of the Mk14. There's the M14, there's the M21, there's the M25, there's the M14 DMR, there's the SOCOM 16, there's the M14 Tactical, there's the M14 SSR, there's the Mk14 Mod 0, there's the Mk14 Mod 1. Here's the Mk14 Mod 2. A dozen different variants, and each time shortly lived and shelved almost immediately. Let's talk about this gun. So this was the Navy's genuinely a Hail Mary, their last chance at, well, making the Mk14 relevant again. You see, this was a very short production run. Only 250 of these guns were ever made, and we've got one here for you. So let's talk about this. Now, to understand the whole idea behind the Mk14, we have to go back to the beginning. 2001. But first, guys, we gotta talk about the homies here of the channel, the biggest supporters, that is AIM Surplus. Guys, these are the GOATs of the 2A industry, a massive online presence, and just super knowledgeable dudes in high-tier customer service. You can't ask for anything more than that in today's day and age. That is the homies supporting the homies, and we can't think of enough to help make these shenanigans continue to shenanigan. And also a huge shout out to you guys tuning in, liking, subscribing, and sharing, and helping us blow this thing up. We're almost 25,000 subscribers away from 1 million. I appreciate you guys just continuing to blow this thing up. So, likes, comment, subscribe, and share. It helps out with the YouTube algorithm, gods. Now, let's talk about FUD maxing 5,000. It didn't take long until, well, really, the first few months of the global war on terror, the troops realized these bolt guns simply do not meet our needs. Our high speed, high maneuverability, just quick and violent course of action, SOPs, and our tactics. It calls for something greater than the M24s and the 308s that we have in our inventory. Now, here's the thing. Those 308 bolt guns absolutely crushed the role that they were designed to fill, but combat had changed. Tactics, they had changed. Simply put, 20 rounds of 308 in a semi-auto beats 5 rounds in a bolt gun. It just matches the pace of play at that time. More rounds on target in less amount of time. But how do we do it? How do we execute just that? Well, the semi-auto sniper system, it was nothing new at that time. Shoot, it had been around for nearly 60 years at that point in time. Since World War II, Germany had been putting scopes on G43s. Russians were putting scopes on SVT-40s. Americans had scopes on M1 Grands. Heck, the M14 itself had been shoehorned into a sniper role since the 60s. What they were asking for was nothing new, but what they got was, well, literally almost 20 different guns in just over a decade. By now, you guys all know the M14 has had, well, an interesting, to say the least, track record as a service rifle. Only having been, well, a few short years as a wide-scale issued rifle. Nearly 1.4 million M14s were made for the military, but was one of the shortest-lived service rifles in, well, just about our entire history. This meant that hundreds of thousands of these M14 rifles were essentially just rotting away in the armory, which gave the top brass some great big ideas. Why aren't we doing something with all of these old rifles? Well, we've got a gorillion of these things just sitting around rotting away. Army marksmanship units and civilians alike have been accurizing this platform and doing cool things with it. Why can't we do that, but on a larger scale? And that's what we have here. Now, keep in mind the AR-10 had already existed for over 40 years at this time point. So a little company called Knight's Armament had already been working with that platform, Reed Knight and Eugene Stoner, the SR-25, and been arming Delta operators and SEALs and other similar caliber operators with that rifle, a semi-automatic AR-10, the SR-25. But Big Army and Big Navy weren't all in on that platform just yet, leaving us with the M14 and trying to make that better. Despite even in the early days of the global war on terror, SR-25s were being fielded in pretty significant numbers, exclusively by these high-tier, high-end operators though. The M14 wasn't really used by those guys in nearly the same scale. But this right here isn't one of those early guns. This is essentially the last of the last of the old breed, the least produced variants of the Mark 14. So, Navy, in all of its wisdom, had said, hey, I know we've got a ton of SR-25s, the M110 and the Mark 11 in service right now, and troops genuinely, they like this platform. When it first rolled out, sure, there might have been a few hiccups, but generally speaking, the platform had been a tremendous success. Why are we still messing and monkeying with this platform? I don't know, to keep it on life support. There's a lot of purists out there, and hey, it's the Navy. Give them a break, guys. And to top it all off, every single one of these Mark 14 variants, whether it was the M21, M25, the Mod 0, the Mod 1, the M39, they had all been shelved at this point and being used extremely small numbers. But they still came out with this. So let's talk about this Mark 14 Mod 2.
So this Mark 14 was drawn up in 2011 by the Navy NECC. That's the Navy Expeditionary Combat Command. They went to Naval Surface Warfare Crane and said, hey, we want our own take and our own updated version of our M14 SSR. It's glass bedded, protocol for maintenance and maintaining these firearms is just too much. We need something a little more simple. The M39 and M14 Mod 1 and Mod 0 were very similar to this, but of course they had to be just a little bit different and come up with their own chassis system in this 22-inch barreled action they dropped into them. So what exactly is the NECC? Well, they're kind of like the Army, but of the water. They do a ton of maritime operations. Now, that's not to say that they can't do things on land, but mainly they're operating out of boats, ships, and things like that. They're not exactly a standalone combat force, but rather a protection force that kind of fills the gap in the joint warfare arena, complements different capabilities of different foreign military partners along with domestic assets. So basically, to sum it up, these dudes have awesome gunboats with 50 cals, miniguns, and sniper systems, but also can take you from point A to point B, take cargo from point A to point B, and just provide overall security. Not necessarily a direct action force, but can be if need to be. Now that we know who used it, let's talk about the actual gun, boys.
So essentially, guys, we have what is every single other M14 variant that was ever made in the early 2000s to early 2010s. Guys, it is a 17-pound M14 thrown into a Sage chassis and accurized. Yes, that is a very generic explanation for this gun, but that's pretty much essentially all it is. So we have a Sage chassis on this, and what makes this thing super rare is that only 250 of these rifles were actually made. This exact contract called for, they wanted a 22-inch barrel essentially. They wanted the extra range, that extra muzzle velocity that you get with a 22-inch barrel. We have a Sage chassis on here, and it is exclusive to the Mod 2 platform. This chassis system is all aluminum, and there's a ton of machining on it to make it just a little bit lighter. This chassis system is pretty cool. Starting at the rear, we have Magpul's actual system here. So we have an adjustable butt plate and also an adjustable cheek riser. On the bottom, we have a piece of Picatinny rail. This is nice if you wanted to put one of those butt pods on there. If you guys ever seen those things, they kick out from the bottom. They're not exactly my favorite. I really enjoy a bag, but I do understand where they come from with this because it does just fold up. You don't have to carry a bag or your backpack everywhere that you go. So let's talk about how the gun runs and how it shoots. It's a solid shooting gun. It's not the smoothest M14 I have ever shot, and I find that kind of interesting because this thing is like 17 to 18 pounds. This is a heavy chunga. Like, you could get a good solid arm day in with this. It just doesn't shoot as smooth as most of these AR-10 platforms that we have today. You've got a lot of reciprocating mass in here. You have the bolt, this big old op rod here. It just kind of has a very interesting kind of kick to it, if you will. It's nothing bad, and it's certainly manageable. It's not bad at all. It's just very interesting and unique to this platform. You have the 22-inch barrel here. This barrel is extremely accurate, I will say. We've got groups of just over 1 MOA 10-shot groups. So that's actually really solid. And for the M14 platform, that's not exactly a tremendously easy feat. A lot of these M14s, they very much struggled. Essentially, a lot of that precision and accuracy issues could boil down to the chassis and how they put these things together. Ultimately, if you didn't use blue Loctite or some sort of serious thread locker to put these things together and keep them in place, you would get a tremendous POI shift, point of impact shift. So one day you could take this gun out and shoot it and have a perfect 100-yard zero, but literally the next day, if you took this thing out, it could potentially have a 1, 2 inch, 3 inch, 5 inch. It didn't matter. It could have a huge POI shift, and that could cause, well, obviously serious issues for the dudes that were using these guns. So ultimately, here's the thing, like, this gun is super nostalgic. It is so much fun. I love the M14 platform. I think it's just objectively an awesome looking gun, and an awesome part of our history. Now, obviously, it didn't go very far, just like every other M14 platform, unfortunately, but you know, it's still super fun to own. It's super fun to clone. I think it is an important part of our history and how, well, these sniper systems were developed. So guys, we have a wrap here on the Mk14 Mod 2. I appreciate you guys tuning in, liking, subscribing, and sharing. It helps out so much. Guys, if you want to check out my Instagram, it's at 110sassactual. And as always, run your gun, not your mouth. Catch you next time.